Do we want to end the war in Ukraine or do we want to perpetuate it? That's kind of important to know, because the answer to that question, or a third possibility, is we want Ukraine to win the war. Those three things have very different policy implications for the United States. And unfortunately, there's no outright stated answer to any of that, but we did get some real clues about at least what NATO is thinking. And we definitely know what President Zelensky in Kiev is thinking, as he just had a press conference. The two of them actually did in Kiev yesterday, where Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had a press conference with President Zelensky in which they laid out kind of what their vision of things is. First of all, I want to give you just a snippet of what Secretary General Stoltenberg said about the purpose of this meeting and the purpose of this operation.
When I was last here in April, we discussed our preparations for NATO's Vilnius summit and your preparations for the counteroffensive. Today, your forces are moving forward. They face fierce fighting, but they are gradually gaining ground. Every meter that Ukrainian forces regains is a meter that Russia loses. And there is a stark contrast. Ukrainians are fighting for their families, their future, their freedom. Moscow is fighting for imperial delusions.
There's two really big important things that Secretary General Stoltenberg said right there, which bear discussion a little bit further. The first one, he said that they are gaining ground. The Ukraine offensive that began in June is tough going, but it's gaining ground. So meaning that, hey, our plan is actually working. It's going forward. The second thing he said was that, Ukraine is fighting for democracy, for their survival, while Russia is fighting for imperial ambition. So again, like has been common throughout this in the Western media, is this is being cast in a good versus evil situation. So the Ukraine side is clearly the good and Russia is clearly the evil. The problem with that is that on September 6th, Stoltenberg himself, in another unguarded moment, inadvertently released that he knows that this is not just an imperial ambition for Russia, that this is actually because of NATO expansion. And because Stoltenberg himself actually admitted on the record that before the war started in the fall of 2021, is that Putin said, hey, no NATO on our border. There's some red lines for us. I've already shown that they would use military force to keep Georgia out of NATO. And now he was clearly communicated, and NATO clearly understood that this was a war and peace decision. If you keep going forward with NATO, then there's going to be war. And he said Stoltenberg said they just flatly took it off the table. And then we know what Hitler sorry for the juxtaposition there. It's kind of obvious. That's what Putin did. So now you can still be completely against what Putin did. You can still say that violated every, international law, just common human compassion and decency, that you can't just use force to get what you want. And I would agree with that. I would absolutely agree. Russia was wrong in launching a war to try to get their objectives. There are other ways that they could have done it. They had plenty of other options. It wasn't a zero-sum situation. However, we also can't be naive enough to know that someone who says, I've got a loaded gun, I'm pointing it at this person, and I'm willing to pull the trigger if you do that, that you then call their bluff and say, oh yeah, well, we're going to do it anyway, and then be surprised when he does it, and then change the conditions afterwards to say, well, it wasn't just because I was foolish and prompted you, put you in a situation to where you would make good on your threats, even though it wasn't necessary for our security, but it's actually his fault because he's the evil guy. And that has implications, because if Russia went to war because of NATO expansion, and if NATO knows he went to NATO expansion, then the question has to become, what should we do then? Should we continue going on with that goal, or should we try to change path and do something else if it's not going to work? Now, the first part of that discussion, Stoltenberg said, we're succeeding. Our plans are working, and Zelensky's forces are moving forward. But are they? As we've talked about in many previous episodes, there is no viable military path to success here. The offensive operation did not succeed, and there is virtually no chance that it's going to succeed. And just to underscore that, yesterday there was headlines that came out that said, in fact, as of this year, Ukraine and Russia Ukraine has not been succeeding, but actually Russia has gained more territory when you put everything together, both what Russia did earlier in the year and what Ukraine did in this last offensive, still benefits and advantages Russia. So the first part of what Stoltenberg said is just not true. They aren't continually moving forward. They've actually lost territory this year in cumulative total. So if the first part of what he said is wrong and he's mischaracterizing the second part, then we have a problem. Well, that problem was deepened when Stoltenberg next said this.
The stronger Ukraine becomes, the closer we come to ending Russia's aggression. Russia could lay down arms and end its war today. Ukraine does not have that option. Ukraine's surrender would not mean peace. It would mean brutal Russian occupation. Peace at any price would be no peace at all. Ukraine needs a just and sustainable peace. And I therefore strongly welcome President Zelensky's 10-point plan to achieve that goal. So, Mr. President, Ukraine's future is in NATO. As we work together to prepare you for that future, NATO will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
That phrase again, for as long as it takes. So even though they know, both Ukraine and NATO, they know that the Ukraine side militarily is not making progress, then they know I'm not the only one that's aware that the military fundamentals do not favor a successful Ukraine position to ever succeed in driving Russia out of its territory. And yet that is exactly what they're committing us to. Now, what outcome do you think is going to happen with that? Now, I get it. Stoltenberg uses all this flourishing, grandiose kind of statements about, they're fighting for their freedom. They're, and all of these kinds of really high sounding, morally high positions. But look, who's being helped by this? Are we helping the Ukraine side when we actually say, look, despite all the things you see on the battlefield, despite all the failure to accomplish militarily what we've been seeking for almost 19 months now, actually, we just passed the 19-month mark, and there is no prospect militarily that that's going to reverse in the other direction. In fact, most evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the more time passes, the greater is going to be the imbalance between the strength of Russia and the growing weakness of the Ukraine side. So why would you want to pursue a policy that any rational analysis would show can't be succeeded, can't be accomplished? And look, Stoltenberg just further undercut things by saying, there's not going to be a negotiated settlement, because he uses the phrase, you can't surrender. Ukraine can't surrender, because if they do, then Russia could just quit and go home, like now, and the war would be over. Well, yeah, sure. I mean, there's certainly truth to that. If Putin just decided, yeah, forget it, he could pick up and go home, and yay, that would be great for Ukraine. But is that going to happen in any rational universe? Is Russia going to do that when they see the same growing imbalance that I just described, because they're helping to create it? So of course they're not going to do that. And then when you say, yeah, we want a just and sustainable peace, and they've defined that as Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. Now, if you're not familiar with that, let me just, clear you in on something. There's no peace plan at all. What Zelensky has put forward, and this was probably more than a year ago, I think, is when he first illuminated this, is it's basically a list of terms of surrender for Russia. There's like, you have to completely withdraw from all territory of Ukraine. We won't talk to you until that time. You have to make reparations, war crimes, all these things. Those are terms that you give to a defeated foe. So, I mean, it's not even insulting to the Russian side to have that. It just makes them angry that you would have the audacity to say this is the terms for peace. And then, of course, in the West, we don't talk about what those 10 points are. We just say the 10-point peace plan, which sounds like, well, look, Ukraine's trying to be reasonable. They want to have peace, and Russia's just not willing to talk. Well, nobody is going to negotiate. I mean, if you want to say that it's a stalemate right now, and some are calling it that because after 19 months of war, you see the lines haven't hardly changed much. Now, who knows what it's going to be in another 19 months, because the more this happens, the more that line could certainly change. But even if you want to say, yeah, it's just a neutral right now, then why would you want to say we're going to continue to go down this path for a 10-point peace plan that's no peace at all, that there's no chance that the other side would even talk about? And before that, we can even get into some potential negotiations, and there are some potential negotiations. So Stoltenberg is dead wrong when he says Ukraine doesn't have the choice. No, they do have a choice. There are decisions that they could make. There are options they could have to have a negotiated settlement that would end the war. Russia's been on record to say this before the war started. They said it after the war started, and they're continuing to say it now. But as I've also said in the past, the longer the West and Ukraine waits to make that deal, the worse it gets for the Kiev side. And that's going to continue to be the case. And the more Ukraine men are going to be slaughtered in this continual attrition warfare battle that's going on all along this 1,000-kilometer front. Now, if anybody has any hope that maybe, with this failure of the Ukraine offensive and the prospect for how things can get worse the rest of the year, maybe Zelensky won't be so quick to jump on this. That hope was also dashed, because after this joint press conference, Zelensky himself had this to say.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was in Kyiv, fruitful negotiations. Not only about our defense now, but also about our strategic defense, the joint defense of everyone in Europe. Ukraine deserves to become a member of NATO, and it will, absolutely. And this is not just our Ukrainian ambition. It is the only effective security perspective for Europe, guaranteeing real lasting peace. I thank each and every one of you who are currently in battle, at combat positions. We are working to provide you with more weapons, more powerful and effective weapons, our Ukrainian weapons, and it will happen.
Okay, it won't happen. I'm sorry to say, and I know that everybody who pulls for Ukraine, everybody whose heart bleeds blue and yellow, I know that's the last thing they want to hear, and it would make them angry. But look, I don't want any more Ukraine blood to be spilled in pursuit of something that can happen. I mean, you hear then Zelensky just reiterate the one thing that actually spurred Russia to decisive action, Ukraine and NATO, is still the case. He says, yes, this is still our objective. This is still what we're going for, and we're going to continue fighting. We're going to get more weapons. But he doesn't have the manpower to do it. He doesn't have the human capacity. Look, let me just point blank tell you, from a military perspective, this is a cold-hearted, real assessment of military capacity. Wars are won by men, not machines. You've heard me say that many times. And this is no example, no exception. If we gave the West and the United States every tank that we have, all of our airplanes, all of our artillery pieces, if we gave them everything that they physically had men to staff, like literally their wish list completely come true, it wouldn't change the outcome. Now, I know that seems counterintuitive to some, but because you have to have experienced leaders, and I'm talking like 3 to 5 for this level, 5 to 10 for this level, 18 to 20 for the top levels. And, you can't fight an organization unless you have people at each of these levels with at least some modicum of that experience. And you can't just get to experience by a few months of training. It's not possible. You can't get experience. You can get people trained to operate tanks, about how to move forward under fire, about how to clear minefields, about how to operate missile systems and air defense systems. You can do all that stuff, but what you can't do is fight effectively with it. Now, the Russian side, for all of their shortcomings and mistakes, they do have the experience at all these different levels, because they started off with a military of almost 1 million active duty troops, and then a couple of million of people that also had lots of experience. So they have many, many times more people to draw from with the experience. And now then they're adding the experience of what they've learned on the battlefield. And so you take someone that has physical experience with now learned lessons learned from the current combat, and you have a much greater chance. And of course, as the industrial capacity of Russia dwarfs anything that Ukraine could come up with, and even the West is not going to be able to meet that shortfall. But you just can't put people in tanks. And look, we're about to find this out with the M1 Abrams, and we're going to talk about that in a separate episode here shortly. But there's just not enough of them. And even if you had enough of them, 10 times the number of what we're promising them, they don't know how to fight them, and you can't teach that on the fly. And so everything points to continuing to go down this path to try to seek NATO membership, to keep putting in Russia's face This is where we're going. Even with all these losses, this is still where we're going. We're still trying to get NATO membership. The thing that drove you to lethal action in the first place, we're continuing down that road. Now, what does anyone think that Vladimir Putin is going to do because of this? I mean, let's just accept from the baseline that Putin is an evil man. He's a murderous man, that all he wants to do is kill Ukrainians. Let's say that all those are true. And there is an element of truth in many of them. That doesn't change the fact that if that guy with that attitude and with this force structure and the future capacity that they're building right now, why would you want to wave a red flag in front of it when you don't have anything to stop that charging bull? Let that sink in for a second. Ukraine does not have the human capacity or the material capacity to stop a concerted, sustained Russian drive. And even if they take years to do it, all it's going to be is a slow death. Or maybe Russia ends up surprising everybody and actually does launch an unexpected offensive operation, which there is some evidence that they may, but no one's going to know until it either does or doesn't happen. But if it doesn't happen, then it's a slow death because there is no rational path for Ukraine to win. So we just have to ask, do we really care about the Ukrainian people? Do we actually want the war to end, or do we actually in the West want it to just continue on indefinitely? Because we can drag it out a lot longer by continuing to give large numbers of ammunition and other kinds of support, intelligence support, targeting support, everything short of pulling a trigger. And we can make the cost much, much higher on Russia, but we can't change the outcome. Now, you can say, well, we want to weaken Russia, but as Chaz Freeman mentioned on a previous episode, that's actually starting to reverse now, because now Russia's learning how to counter the Western military's best effort, their best technology. And that's actually making them, as more time goes by, a greater threat to us. So if you wanted to weaken Russia, we could have made that happen in 2022. We could have ended the war then. We could have ended the war in early 2023, and that would have been the result. Then Russia's wartime innovation would have slowed down because they wouldn't have to have fought anymore. But as it is, it's accelerated. And more time goes by, they're going to become more lethal because they're going to know better how to counter our technology. Think about that for a second, too. So if you're wanting to have an outcome that benefits the United States, our national security, that benefits NATO and makes us more secure, then you want this war to end as soon as possible under the best terms we can get for Ukraine, so that we actually have a buffer between here and Russia. And that's something that would be acceptable to Russia, because they have no interest in Western Ukraine. They don't want to garrison it. They know how disastrous that would be. It's not even his objective, meaning there is room to negotiate. No matter what anybody tells you, the truth is there is room to negotiate. And the longer we wait, it'll be an uglier one for Kiev, but it's still possible. But you keep in this path, you continue to ignore all that and just say, no, we're going to cling to our preferred outcome of a complete Ukrainian victory, you may end up with a defeat. And that is your deep dive for today. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next episode.